Hi everyone, we'll be starting in about 5 more minutes. Do grab a drink from the back if you're thirsty and make yourself comfortable. Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for coming down to today's event. I'm Ziying from SGInnovate, and we are very happy to collaborate with General Assembly to bring you tonight's event. At SGInnovate, we believe Singapore has the capabilities and resources to tackle hard problems from around the world, and part of it includes knowledge sharing sessions like the one you're here for today. So without further ado, I'll hand over the mic to Gabriela, who will talk to you more about General Assembly. Gabriela, please.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Gabriela and I lead marketing for a company called General Assembly. May I know how many of you have heard about us before? Hands up. How many of How many of you have attended our event before? Hands up. And how many attended SGInnovate event before? Let's compare. We have more people. As you know, General Assembly is an educational company. We are headquartered in New York. We have 15 campuses all around the world. We are focusing on teaching people applicable skills, digital marketing, UX design, and of course, data. This is why today's discussion will be about achieving data literacy across the organization. We do data trainings for individuals and corporates. So if you want to find out more, just talk to me after the event or just go to ga.co. And for now, let me introduce Pavel. Pavel is CEO of Milieu, and he will be leading today's evening. So have fun and ask many questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela. Good evening, guys. My name is Pavel. I find myself moderating panels like this quite often, but I think this one is quite fitting. I have co-founded a company called Milieu, which is a Singapore-based data company. We build a software called Customer Data Platform, so the word data is kind of everywhere. And I have also helped start a local kind of a not-for-profit movement called She Loves Data, which is a platform where we in like 6 different countries, 7, 8 different cities, help kind of bridge the gender gap in IT in data, and we educate women and kind of help them make a first few steps into the technology with more like a hands-on courses. So I feel like this is the literacy and the data that's like something that's quite close to be both of those bits. So I have this is quite intimate space. It's quite small. So the way I would like to do it, I have a kind of 6-7 topics for the speakers. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves one by one in a bit, and I would like to do it in a way where rather than kind of having me asking questions and doing Q&A where you can ask stuff in the end, if you have something to say on the topic and if you would like to ask and follow up questions on anything any one of them is saying, please do it at any point in time. So we make it a little bit more interactive, so we don't feel like we are in a theater and kind of acting it out for you here. So, okay, if we can do that, that will be fantastic. So let's begin with the introductions themselves. If you guys want to take each every 2 minutes, maybe let's have it, Mike, Steve. So
okay, yeah, I guess everyone looked at me, so I'm going to do it. And I'm going to start off here. It's good that we're on opposite sides, because so Pavel is the COO of a startup called Milieu. I'm the CEO of a startup called Milieu. So just get that out of your system. Our logos look very different. So I'm the CEO of a consumer insight startup called Milieu. That's been running for, we've commercially launched our product about 2 months ago. Before Milieu, I worked at another global research company for a couple of years where I was the MD for Southeast Asia. And before that, I was in a number of different agencies where I ran in-house analytics departments. So I worked at a company called MRM McCann, where I was hired on as a business analyst. MRM McCann is part of the IPG McCann World Group of agencies, and I moved on eventually to work for companies like Publicis Sapient. So I kind of had experience in kind of different sized agencies, but also being a in-house agency analyst kind of expert also, but now being a provider of data services. So that's me.
Okay, tough act to follow. Hi everyone, Shree here. I'm actually heading up the corporate recruitment for Singapore and Philippines for Go-Jek. So just a show of hands, how many of you took Go-Jek to get here? Woohoo, okay. So I've been with Go-Jek for about 9 months now, based in Singapore. And prior to this, I have been predominantly with the financial services sector, JP Morgan, Visa, and Redmart before I joined Go-Jek. So looking forward to talk a little bit more about data in the context of not just hiring, but human resources capital, to talk about HR business partners, HR operations, and how much gap there is or lack thereof in terms of how data can be utilized further, and what is the understanding of data in an organization, and how HR can come in to talk about educating the workforce as well around data literacy.
My own. Hey, hi, I'm Vivek, and as you can see, I'm part of the Ernst & Young data and analytics practice. So just one thing, Ernst & Young, when you hear, you think about audit and taxation, but they have a pretty large consulting practice too, and I'm part of that, heading the data and analytics piece. Before this, I was with IBM, again, driving the data and analytics for their clients across the globe. Worked across some 30-odd countries in various sectors, airlines, retail, consumer goods, etc., to help them, deploy analytics as part of their business. And then before that, working with various marketing and advertising agencies. So happy to be here today. Look forward to the exciting discussion. Thank you.
So I'm Ben. I work for the Dentsu Aegis Network, which hopefully some of you have heard of. So it's the largest agency network in APAC and actually founded out of Japan. So we're proud of that heritage. But because of that heritage, there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of making the organization revolve around data. So from a marketing agency standpoint, we have a background in creative, we have a background in media with our acquisition of Aegis. There's a need to really transform the organization as our clients are transforming to make sure that the potential is there, that the culture is there, that we have the right talent. So I think from my background, I try to bring that all together in terms of influencing who we hire. We have our Global Data Innovation Center based here, which I'm tightly aligned with, and really focusing on the type of culture change that I think we all agree needs to happen throughout all the big multinational companies that are our clients.
Thank you, guys. All right, so just so we can get a bit of a gauge of the audience, who here works in somehow data-related to role as an executive, kind of hands-on? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so about 2, 5, maybe 10%. Business, marketing. Okay, what the rest of you do? Sales, finance. Okay, large company, like MNC startups. Okay, fair enough. All right. So when you put the term data literacy into Google and you look at the Wikipedia page for which it has as any other phrase, you're going to get a definition around something along the lines of ability to read, interpret information. So that could be looking at a weather forecast and being able to say what 20% chance of rain actually means. So everyone has some baseline level of data literacy. I'd kind of like to split the conversation here today in two levels. I'd love to kind of hear more of an organizational one. So how do your respective companies, where do you find them to be right now, in a sense? More from a perspective that every one of you is from a very different organization. So we have a startup, we have a kind of a scale-up billion unicorn, we've got a traditional, more of a corporate side consultancy, and large multinational agency. So what does that what does it look like across the organizations? Are you happy where you are in terms of data literacy, in your own way of defining it?
I think you can guess based on my introduction, no. That's one of the reasons my job exists. So I think there's a lot of room to get there. I had 2 people within the past 2 months. We're the largest customer of Google in APAC. And they hire the people that I've hired. And so I think from a talent standpoint, there's going to be a continued struggle, which I imagine you all face, to make sure that you have the right people in the organization to effectively get the organization to where it needs to be. So that's, in short, no.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a wide spectrum of companies out there. I think there are certain companies which I would call data native companies. You know, the companies which are born in the digital economy. For them, you know, data is really the Rajanatara, so they are driven by data. So in their case, I think the literacy and the adoption of data practices is much higher. But then there are traditional companies which are trying to evolve or to use more data, but I think that struggle is still quite a bit there. You know, I think a very few percentage of companies have gotten in that space. Companies are still struggling with getting their data act together and then making people realize the value of, you know, how they can utilize that data. Yeah.
So I think for myself, I'll talk about what we have done and, you know, some of the challenges that we face in our headquarters in Indonesia, right? Because we have 18 products, and that has been built over a span of over 9 years. So with that, as you can imagine, we cover food, there's payments, there's transport. So there's a lot of data that we do have. And it's about mining that data. It's about how are we utilizing that data. So from an organizational perspective, I think we still do have, we have made some efforts to kind of utilize the data in a way to, it's not just for customers, but for us to improve our services, but that is one aspect. And the other aspect of it is from what I'm familiar with, which is from HR perspective, right? So I guess there are certain, for example, from a systems perspective, or be it about the way we structure our teams and how much our decision is made around data, there's definitely steps that we're taking towards it, but there's still a lot of room for improvement because often there is a fear, and this could be in our stakeholders' minds as well as within the teams, is how do you effectively use data? So there's still that conversation around using data, how do we present that, and how do we get folks, and this is different generations in the workforce, how do we get them to be comfortable with using data as well?
I'll answer this, I guess, in two ways. One with where I'm at and where I was before. I'd say in the context of Milieu, I'd say I am quite happy with the way we are because A, we're a data company. What we do is literally data as a service, and also we're a startup with a really lean team. So we naturally have hired in people that come from backgrounds in research and analytics, and it's just easier for us to we have to do a lot more with less. So I think we've kind of, and our founder also comes from an extensive kind of analytics background. So it was kind of in the DNA even before I joined. That doesn't mean that we can't be doing things better. And actually, I think the thing that worries me is that as we scale, how do we hold on to that kind of, that culture around always kind of knowing how to use data at the right time. But if I go back to probably actually my agency days when I was at like Publicis and IPG before that, I was generally all those roles that I had, I was often the first one in the local market, the first kind of analytics hire. So I was often kind of setting up teams, and there was a real struggle. We've said the word struggle a few times already, and I don't think that struggle has disappeared since I've left the agency world, because it is, whether you're talking about how you're selling data as a service to a client or how you're kind of getting the rest of the business to start thinking in more kind of data-driven things, the struggle is real, and it's not something that is going to be, you can't just hire a team and have a data offering and hope that it's going to, and procure a tool and then overnight everyone's all of a sudden more data-driven. It takes years to cultivate the culture that you need or nurture the culture that you need to do it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I would just add one point here, though. While the struggle is there, but I think the struggle is really worth it. And I kind of just quote a study that we recently completed. It's a global study which said that, distinguish between companies that have adopted the data versus who have not done so. The companies that have adopted the data, their kind of profitability is 30 to 40% higher than the companies who have not been doing so. So clearly, I think the struggle is well worth it if you were to kind of embark on that journey.
That leads us a certain way, but I want to keep the talent bit kind of for the second part. So organizational level, we get that. It's hard to hire generally people with the right skill sets. And we sometimes, I would say, as organizations generally even struggle in providing the right environments for that skill sets, right? Like what I see in my kind of everyday interactions is I often see like a data science aficionados who are like lured into these companies, and they end up pushing out like being effectively like a report sweatshop, right? And that's not what these people want to be doing. So that's another thing I think you need to look at. Does the company actually can sustain a practice like this on an ongoing basis? It's not necessarily about hiring the people, but also the retention of them and like making sure they are successful in the practice, right? So that's a topic on its own, I think. I would like to go more down into the personal level, because when you look at data literacy, I think that has an impact into everyone's daily lives. Like you have every single one of you in context of 20 years ago have a supercomputer in their pockets or in your hands looking at your Instagrams. We don't use them to necessarily the best potential. That's another topic altogether. But generally, you are working with data, whether you notice it or not. Like every single piece of information you submit and surrender to Google or anyone, the government, about yourselves is a piece of data, right? So I think that should be a part of a literacy from a more personal standpoint. So how do you view that? Like how much are you aware of your own data consumption, sharing, availability? Where do you personally are you protective about it? Do you use every single blocker available in your Chrome or whatnot? How do you look at that?
So I think let me take that. I actually, I have 2 teenage daughters. So therefore, that's a big concern and a big point of discussion. The whole, what you're going to say on the social media and how you're going to share your private information and what kind of agreements are you going to kind of agree to without even really looking at that. But I think they're getting more aware about that in one way. Getting more sensitive about what information they want to give out, what information they don't want to share. They're becoming more aware. and especially I think the news circulating, I mean, as there is more and more information around how corporates are using the information and how it can be potentially misused, that there is a certain amount of awareness which is happening. That's one perspective. But on the other hand, there's the usage of data. So my younger daughter, who is an artist, who draws, and she has her own Instagram account. So every time she'll make a post, and then she'll keep checking, okay, how many unique visitors have come in, how many have commented, what. So all of that they will keep a track of. So I think both ways, while sharing their own information versus utilizing the information, that the kids are getting, smarter by the day.
I would also say, just like, I think it is, if businesses are moving towards being data-driven and making data at the forefront of a lot of their decisions, then humans should be doing it too, to some degrees. Like, there's a couple of things that I'm kind of a geeky person, but like, when I bought a Fitbit, that was kind of like, I thought I would actually only wear it for like 2 months, and I've worn it for like 6 years. And so having that data point was all of a sudden really interesting, because like I could know, if I didn't take enough steps, I'd game the system and, take a few more. And another thing I do a lot is we track all of our expenses. I use this cool app called Toshal, and that was like I don't know what I did before not knowing how much money I spent, per month and different things. And so, again, I'm kind of a geeky person, but I think, why is it so businesses should just be able to, use data in a more, and make more profit. I think realistically, the skill sets that we're trying to cultivate in businesses are better used in human life and for people. So I do actually think that people should be using data more in their kind of daily lives.
I'll give a quick anecdote related to an along. So my helper gave in order to borrow money from an along, had to give our address and our phone number. And what I found out very quickly was how quickly somebody that's keen to get paid money that they think they are owed can find information about you. And one of the key roles that I have is data governance for our company, right? But the fact that my wife had a picture of our family on her WhatsApp, and then he was able to, by knowing my name, find me on Facebook. And while most things I don't post publicly, just to a friend group, find out, well, there's certain posts, and okay, so his boss must be this, go onto LinkedIn, and then very, very quickly put together a profile of what organization I worked in, who my boss was, who my kids were. He obviously had her address. And very recently, despite me having meetings with Facebook and Google on a weekly basis, realize I probably needed to dial it back. And being a geek, I tend to give my data a bit more freely because I see the value that I get in return. But in certain circumstances, even in, say, Singapore, your eyes can get opened very quickly as to what your digital halo is out there.
Yeah, I also do use ad blockers.
So I think from my perspective, I think the first time around that I got to feel the personal impact of this was when my mom started using social media. And then I was like setting up the account for her, and there was information that she was putting up, and that was the difference. Like, I was more willing to share my information, and my mom was like, "Why do they need this?" Right? And then so there's the different generations that you're dealing with. So on a personal level, I also then took it as I took a step back, and I'm like, okay, am I really sharing too much of information, and how much is too much? And then I realized that the threshold for each individual is different. And I started looking at, okay, let me just start looking at some of the things that I'm agreeing to now. What is this information? And also when I started then putting together sort of events for the company, and in Singapore, I think when we had PDPA that came about, suddenly our consent forms became so much more lengthier. And I was like, what's all this really about, right? So it's really about taking time to find out what is it about as opposed to just taking it on and following it. I think on a personal level, I've just become more accountable towards what I'm putting out there and what I'm agreeing to. Yeah.
You know, and I guess, I mean, from a personal level and from an organizational level, what we talk about all the time is what is the value exchange. So there was research that was done, I think, I don't know, maybe a month ago that came out in China. And I think 80% of people said they would be willing to give their data, but they just needed to have a sense of what the value was. So being able to articulate what that value is and be transparent about what is going to be done with that data related to the value that you're getting for it, I think is essential as a person and as data professionals, right?
So yeah, I think I found an interesting experience. So I was at my daughter's school so there was this presentation about perils of social media. They were showing some film about it. And one of the parents was working at Facebook. And there was this whole discussion around.
Did she disclose that? She probably.
So yeah, I think that we caught up later, and so. But I mean, as a parent, you know, he had also the similar issues, you know, and which he could kind of associate with. Yes, but that was a tough spot to be in.
I think the exchange of that value needs to be really transparent. And coming from Europe, where the kind of the privacy laws get spearheaded with GDPR and everything else, kind of being considered probably in few years, we're going to look back at it as a kind of new global standard. That's you know, we often complain about the bureaucracy of the European Union, but if I look at it in the context of, you know, US, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, the kind of the protectionism around consumer doesn't have a parallel. It's kind of really like Wild West everywhere else. So I've kind of started paying attention to, for example, when I'm installing a new app, it's now a little bit more transparent around asking you questions or like giving specific set of permissions for specific things. And a few weeks ago, I'm installing a meditation app. It wants to see my contact list. I'm like, no, you're supposed to give me a meditation advice. You don't need to see my contact list. Absolutely no. So, you know, once you kind of start looking into this, it's always a rabbit hole that you can go down to. You would end up not using anything in the end. But it's an interesting thing. I think the awareness is really important here.
Can we ask the audience how many of you have heard of GDPR? Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I think that in and of itself is quite indicative of the importance of what we're discussing today. That the fact that I mean, obviously you've come to hear this, so perhaps you're predisposed to the topic. But you know, when I found out, and we used to do debunking GDPR. What does it really mean? What's the influence out here? It amazed me how many questions there still are around it, what the implications are, but that people know of it, which itself indicates that it's important.
Absolutely. So on a country level, we've talked about a little bit of what it is like in Singapore. You guys, most of you have some exposure to like a regional work or perhaps even global. Where do you see Singapore specifically sitting in the kind of, let's say, if we establish some kind of benchmark of the literacy here, data-wise, adoption-wise? So what does that look like on a infrastructure of a government here?
So I could speak to a little on that. With the Smart Nation project that we have taken on, I think that's a lot of focus on data literacy. So for example, NYP, one of the polytechnics, they actually started a course around data analytics and a lot of the information that's covered in the course is around data literacy. So I think there is the stance that they have taken to kind of lead and pave the way. But I believe that it can't be a Singapore-led initiative. It needs to become ASEAN. Right, so that's where looking across the different sort of countries that, like for example, even myself, data protection or even anything on data literacy varies very differently from Singapore to Indonesia or even Vietnam or Philippines or Thailand. So often there are certain sensitivities that I hold to, which may not necessarily be the case in Vietnam, for example. So I have learned to sort of put together my own checklist of what I need to look out for in terms of data, especially when I'm doing hiring. So it's very interesting to see how Singapore, while is in a way leading the initiatives in a lot of its ways through Smart Nation project, I believe there also needs to be that bigger sort of amalgamation with ASEAN in order to really have a framework around data literacy that would not just benefit folks in Singapore, but around the different countries that we have here in Asia.
Yeah, I think whilst Singapore is pretty ahead, but there's some of the practices which are, so for example, I mean, if you would ask for a social security number from someone in US, it's like you don't really give it out. It's top secret. It's your identity. But we share our identity number here like anything with anyone. Even if I have to enter a building or I have to go to a cinema hall, something, it's just open for everyone. It's just an open number, and then I think government is getting more sensitive towards it. I think they have issued guidelines now that they can't let people capture the identity numbers, but I think that's one example. And then overall, I think the data usage per se is pretty higher. Look at the gadgets, look at the data generating devices, that's much higher, and which kind of therefore drives the literacy and the familiarity with data.
The thing I would say is I do really like how a lot of the institutions in Singapore have really embraced analytics and data science. And so, if I was going to go back and do a master's again, I would and I could choose any school in the world, I would definitely choose, SMU has an amazing analytics program. And I was actually up at Republic Polytechnic a couple weeks back, and they have a really amazing research program within their school, and they have really amazing facilities for training their students on how to do research, whether it's kind of focus groups or online or eye tracking surveys. There's definitely a lot of investment in the different schools to build up good curriculums and programs to train students. And I think also like things like smart cities and the Singapore government's kind of embracing of everything from AI and big data is really good. I do think that most of the learnings will always come from experience. So there's a really big responsibility on the companies to really push the needle on this as well. So, I mean, it's great for the schools to teach a research program, but when you actually go in and face a real world scenario with making a decision on data or trying to scrutinize data that might be potentially bad or something else, I think the experience component is really important. So I actually think that the government institutions are doing a great job. I think companies have not done enough. Companies that necessarily don't have a history in data solutions, they haven't done enough to really step up their kind of company training on data literacy.
Yeah, I guess I would say I don't think probably any of us in this room, given recent news, could credibly say that the country's where it needs to be. When I got an SMS message saying that my SGH data could be affected, when we've seen the AIDS data being leaked, et cetera, right? I think for me, Smart Nation, as far as I saw it, was built out of, we want to be a leader in terms of tech, and having companies here that view data as a priority and have built business models around data. But the reality is that, data is a thing. It's ones and zeros. And where is that data? Who has access to that data? What's the related governance? And what is the culture of the people that have access to it? Those are all elements that you can't fix with tech. And so I think the need is really for people to bring it together, which is why HR, I think we've all said, is so important, because any one of those elements, be it I sit with lawyers all day, I sit with our CTO all day, it's about bringing it together strategically and culturally from an operational and a process standpoint. And I think that's a very, very difficult thing to do for a government. So Singapore is, I think, done as good as I can expect, but there's definitely a ways to go.
I quite agree with Steve on the sort of the note of the educational system, like when you are looking at people who study. Where I think we need to speed up a little bit more is generally the the actual like mature population society when you're looking at upskilling. I think there's a stat that I came across listening to one of my favorite shows this morning that it's US based, and it said something around that an average person in US changes an industry, changes a job 3.5 times in 10 years, in a decade. And if you look at a segment for under 35, so people 25 to 35, that's the number stays same, but it's not a job, but it's an industry. So that's quite telling in itself. So what your organization's been doing in this case to kind of counter that? Because if someone have graduated, and yeah, I mean, that's great that we have the schools that are going to produce next generations of data analytics and data science professionals, but how are we upskilling the current people in the workforce? How are we keeping them relevant? So how do we do that? How are your organizations you're seeing or working with doing that?
So I think, for example, one of the projects that we have been working on with the Singapore government actually is to really study the skills that are going to be required in future. So basically analyzing a whole lot of job postings that happen. We kind of identify early, what's the trend like, what are the new skills that are going to be required, and then match that with the capabilities that are available in the population and identify where the gaps are, so that then government can take initiatives to plug those gaps.
So where are they?
I'm sorry?
So where are they? Where are the gaps?
So I think, rightly so, data science, AI, blockchain, so some of those newer technologies where there is suddenly a lot of demand which is happening, but there are not enough professionals to kind of take care of those. So yeah, temporarily, filling it by getting skills from outside, but eventually the aim is to really build a local pool of resources in that space.
Do you see organizations like companies, not necessarily governmental organizations, businesses, building out like internal? So an example, I've been on a panel a couple weeks ago where there was a lady from Telstra who says like for a 100-year-old company, like they have an incredible university program inside of the company that helps kind of to bring up young leaders of sort of the tomorrow or next gen. So what do you see there? Yeah,
I think a lot of companies are starting that off. I mean, and it is really spirited by the consulting companies like the the IBMs or the EY, or each one of these companies have their own badge program or some kind of a talent engagement program, which is now being taken over by the a lot of large organizations like Unilever or P&G. They're setting up their own internal teams and in-house training capabilities. So I think it's progressing quite well.
I guess, I mean, we have a mix of ages in this room, but I think from a millennial standpoint, which unfortunately I fall outside of, the people want to do something that matters and something that's engaging. And so we used to go to all of these career fairs and, hey, we're a cutting edge agency and you should join us, Mr. Data Scientist or Engineer. And as you might expect, that didn't really work. What we did differently about a month ago was we partnered with Google, and we, because of our partnership there, had access to some of their cutting edge stuff, this Ads Data Hub technology. And we did a hackathon. So we went to the universities, students that were interested. We had them apply, put them into groups, and we had them hack in our office for half a day. And we found that from an engagement standpoint, that was a much better way to do it. I think talking about older professionals, of which the bucket I fall in, I think it needs to start from the top. So, anything from a cultural standpoint, you need to have somebody that values it enough to make it part of the culture, part of the compensation, the KPIs, the hiring strategy, and then facilitate that learning through organizations like General Assembly and others to make sure that the right upskilling is happening.
So I love the hackathon idea because, like I said earlier, I think that if you're relying on only like book skills or what you learned in school, you're only filling your cup halfway. So the companies that embrace like saying, okay, you could stop your work and let's do something that's not billable for a day or something, like a hackathon is an amazing idea. But on the other side, I think also on the learning side, companies should definitely be investing in upskilling. But they also, I think a lot of companies, the bigger ones, have this sense that they need to do it themselves. I mean, that 100-year-old company example is probably good because they have a very rigorous program. But I've been in agencies that tried to build really kind of shallow and toothless learning programs themselves. And it's like, you know what, you should just partner with other professional organizations like Hyper Island or General Assembly. I know I'm going to get shouted at for mentioning the other brand name, but like there are lots of, or even academics or schools. So I guess essentially the companies shouldn't try to do everything themselves. There's lots of great curriculums and content already out there in the market. So and try and find that balance of learning and experience as well.
So just to finish up on this one, I think so there's two ways to look at it, right? There are students who are still studying, and then you have employees in organizations, and how, as an employer, we are giving them the tools that they need to continue to be not just data literate, but keep themselves updated. So a lot of the corporate universities, it started off with your vanilla kind of training programs on soft skills, on communications, but that we have come a long way from that. You would see a lot of financial literacy programs that go on, and a lot of times what happens is learning and development teams no longer decide for themselves what's important. They have engagement programs with employees, they hear what they have to say, and then they incorporate programs accordingly. So in my previous company, Redmart, where they had Redmart Academy, there was like weekly sessions where the data scientists and the team will actually hold like Friday pizza sessions. People would sit down and talk about what are the new tools that they are using, and then there could be questions that they can ask. And in a way, it kind of paves for internal mobility as well. So someone who's interested in data science but not necessarily equipped in that from a skill set perspective, he starts shadowing them or working with them, and then sooner or later they have that opportunity to move into that role. And then if we were to look at universities, for example, I think one of the things that I've noticed is particularly SUTD. When we went there, a lot of the employers had this comment about how the rigorous projects that they work on is actually a lot more projects than some of the other universities. So they get a lot more exposure to working with employers and to hone the skills. And again, it's not just core like technical skills, but also to learn how to present data to stakeholders. How do you communicate with them effectively? So I guess it's a two-way engagement, and to be honest, I personally feel that there's still quite a bit of room in our education system for us to bring in a little bit more on coding and just technical skill set, just to give the practice that students need in order to be able to go out there and do what is it that they want to do. They don't have to necessarily come and join employers. They could want to start something on their own, but to give them the skill set, to give that confidence for them to go out and start something on their own as well.
Interesting. So again, we wind up in the kind of talent pool once again, right? So this is interesting. I'd like to kind of get your point of view, guys, on how you kind of view the traditional education versus alternative credentials or like real life experience. I'll give you an example. So in my company, we had a lady who started with us as a tester, Q&A, documentation, bit of everything, because we're a small company and 20 people. And she just showed so much aptitude by taking Coursera, like a 9-month long course, like taught herself a Python, taught herself SQL, and within a year she's a junior analyst on the team and one of the better ones. So like we totally kind of encourage that and welcome that. So how do you, and I know, there was a few years ago, a year or two ago, there was the headline from Google that they no longer look at education credentials for most, at least programming roles at this point, because it makes sense. If you're looking for some sort of cutting-edge JavaScript framework like React, which only exists 4 years, you hardly, your computer science degree for 5 years doesn't really make sense because you wouldn't have any exposure to any of this back then. So how do you view that? Like where, if you were saying, reiterate the point of talent being a struggle, like what are the types of credentials you are looking for in people, or what you are kind of willing to overlook if it's really that hard to hire these days?
I'd say, and I imagine I'll hear it echoed later, it really has to do with drive and attitude fundamentally, because I think in this day and age, I mean, you reference how often people change jobs. Everybody's going through digital transformation now, right? So, to your point earlier, if you don't stay ahead of that by continually educating yourself as a professional, you are going to be left behind. So I think hiring the people that embrace that is essential, more so than, where they went to school or necessarily what their core skill set is. And what I hear everyone say these days is you need to be a T person, right? So you have to be able to spread and be able to problem solve and think across a variety of different disciplines, but have a core expertise deep, hence the lower part of the T, in a particular area, which increasingly is data analytics and programming. So that's my perspective.
If I could add in on that as well. So echoing that point for sure, we are no longer just looking at where the person might have gotten their degree or their master's from, and I can quote examples. So one of the examples that I am very fond of is we had someone who was not, by education, wasn't information systems or programming, that they were doing accounting and finance, but he was really, really interested in doing a technical role, and we were like, so the hiring managers were like, I'm not quite sure, right? So then it's my job in recruitment to go and find out what is it and why is he so interested in this. So often we would end up going to places like Stack Overflow and GitHub, where people actually put up programs that they have worked on. And these could be passion projects, it could be personal projects that they have worked over for months or years, and we actually show that to the hiring managers and go like, hey, well, look at this, right? And once that's done, and then typically with all the tech roles, you're given a coding challenge, right? And how you do the coding challenge or code pairing session, or however they might call it, makes the difference. Because traditional sort of backgrounds, while gives you that information that you need for fundamentals, there are people who learn these things on their own nowadays. So I personally feel that companies are at a loss if they're only looking at someone from traditional backgrounds, from education point of view, and to look at the holistic picture, like I said, GitHub, Stack Overflow, look at some of the projects that they're doing, see how is it that they have developed some of these passion projects that they have, and that's actually what I do when I was doing my technical recruitment, which is to go like, let me profile all of these people, send them over, have a discussion, bring them in, and also another fun thing that they have mentioned about hackathons, right? So a lot of the folks who take part in hackathons, you will see a good number of technical folks and a couple of people who are like, I'm just really passionate about it. I want to be in it, and I just want to be involved and see what is it that I can do. So a lot of the time talents that we bring in would be, I say, a mix of people who have the technical background as well as people who can showcase the talents that this is what I've learned through learning it on my own.
Yeah, I agree, and I also think that kind of underlines a little bit of a misconception that there is in the industry, is that if you want to work in data, you need to be coder, like you need to know some sort of statistical modeling or math or whatnot, where that's definitely one arm, but there's a whole area of jobs that you could be doing where you don't have to touch a line of code in your life. And I would almost go out to argue that some of the most critical and valuable and rare kind of skill sets are when they are a mixture, when this is someone who used to be hands-on but also speaks business, and that's really rare. Like, I really like these people, but they are extremely rare.
So I think that's just such an important point, because we talked a lot about data, but I mean, with something, I think it kind of goes without saying, but data is a discipline, it's not a job function. And so it's a discipline with lots of applications. There's engineering, there's analysis and storytelling, there's management, there's even legal implications to it. And so, I've met people that, so data literacy in the context of data engineering is kind of something that's very specific compared to other roles. I think generally when we're talking about baseline data literacy, say for an organization, you tend to be in the realm of more like kind of constructive thinking or critical thinking. And so going back to the start of this this question, the two skills I would say is that, like, regardless of your hard skills, if you know Python or data science skill sets, it's creativity and constructive thinking. And so generally it helps if you go into, or you've gone through some coursework in your university or Polytechnic or whatever that teaches you those skills. It kind of, again, fills your cup up a bit, but again, those things can be taught as well. It's harder to teach someone to be creative and think open in an open way than it's very easy to teach hard skills. So you can teach anyone Python or research methods, very quickly. It takes a lot longer to teach someone to think kind of out of the box. And those are the two things that I think are most critical: is creativity, being able to look at a solution and say, maybe there's a different way of doing this, and constructive thinking, looking at a data set or looking at results and saying, is this right, or was this data collected the right way? But I think the point that you mentioned too is that, like, there are so many different applications and skill sets within data, and it definitely doesn't require coding in every single one of those buckets.
I think I kind of agree with what's been said. I think I'd just say that from a personal experience and personal kind of example. So 10 years back, I used to run loyalty programs for companies. And I had no clue about analytics or whatever. Just had interest. And yesterday I'm building neural networks, support vector machines, and whatnot, doing data architecture for various organizations. So I think I tend to look at people who I'm hiring from the same perspective, who have the passion, who have the desire to use analytics to solve business problems. I think that's really the key. I mean, analytics in itself is not a goal in itself. It's about being able to solve the problems, and so that mindset is therefore very, very critical.
I guess one other thing I'd add, and you're perhaps better to speak to it, but I think it's an important point. Did you get a degree from SMU? Have you worked at Google? Have you worked at a startup? Those are all hiring decision maker shortcuts to hire you, right? So, he went to that school, well, he must be smart. It's a shortcut to making a hiring decision, right? He was able to get a job here, then that means he must be good, right? So it's a hiring decision maker shortcut to hire you. But I think the opportunity for all of you in this room that are interested in this industry, if you're not in it already or looking to transition to be more in it, is we've all just said that there's a shortage of talent, and people are starting to get creative about how they find it. So that means if you have that passion and you are learning yourself and find a way to showcase that work that you're doing in a practical way, that's a huge opportunity for everyone in this room, regardless of what school you went to or what companies you've worked for.
Cool. Thanks, guys. It's really interesting kind of points of where I really like where this is going. Got a question where if we're talking about kind of a future-proofing skill sets here, effectively, in some sense also, what would your advice be to someone who is, we don't have that many technical people here today, so say someone who is 25, straight out of B school, and is kind of looking at staying relevant for over the next 10 years, what should they be learning as a specific skills? And let's kind of leave aside the whole curiosity, passion, like you can't really teach that, but there's no course here. I looked for that. But what would you recommend them to learn? It's kind of more like specific skills and languages or methods.
I would say, I think broadly 3 areas, and whilst you have to learn really all 3 areas, but you will be, like I was saying, T-shaped skills. So you'll have to be broad and deep in one, and those 3 would really be. Whether you are more business oriented, you want to really drive the business. In that case, you're actually consuming analytics. You're not really doing it yourself. But you should know what analytics and how it can help you and how it will be used to take the business decisions. And therefore, you need to build capability on the business side. Then there are more people who are maths oriented, who love solving problems using mathematical statistical issues. So that'll be the second set of skills. So building deep capabilities, understanding maths and data science capabilities. And the third would be the hardcore engineers, who kind of plumb the things together to make sure the data is flowing well and all the machinery for data is kind of well oiled. I think that's a very critical need. I mean, typically they would make the data science jobs to be much more sexier, much more attractive in nature, but I think the data engineering part is equally, if not more, critical than that as well. So those would be the 3 broad skill areas, and idea would be to really build deep capability in one of them, but have a good understanding of the rest of the 2 as well.
I would just add
follow-up question on that, if I may. Sorry, Steve. Okay. In that sense, if you say, I'm 25, out of school, I have sort of certain baseline of something, right? Do you believe more in building out the strong capability further and deeper, or rather, instead of addressing my sort of lower points, say I'm genius Python coder, data scientist, should I be learning communication and presentation skills, or like deepening my understanding of, say, neural networks or machine learning?
I think I'll focus on building the deep skills first, and then as I grow along, then I'll be picking up the other skills. That'll be part of my the job that I'm delivering. So if I'm delivering a Python analysis or something, as I grow along, I would be able to pick up how should I be sharing that information with and how the data should be flowing in. But as a starting point, I should really focus on building deeper capabilities on the areas that I'm really keen at.
The only thing I would throw into that is the deep depth in the context of, like, something like data science or programming. Depth could just be, your craft and your kind of the general area of study or something. But depth could also mean that you're an expert in Ruby or Python or something like that. And I would be careful with that, because it's also helpful to be, agnostic in certain ways in your craft, because, certain programming languages come and go, and platforms kind of come and go as well. So I'm not saying don't be a master in your craft, but one story is that when I came out of university, the world of business intelligence and BI, SAP was the only person in town. So business objects was like, killing it, market share wise. And I had a friend who became an SAP business objects certified, and he was just. I was broken out of school, and he was making more money than I could believe, and it was just, things were going really well for him. And then, 10 years later, the world of kind of data warehousing and BI has completely changed from, really, the big players coming in with really easy to use platforms. Even companies like Kabula make it a lot easier to, kind of transform data, get it out of one place and into another. And my friend is now at a point where he's got to go back to school because SAP Business Objects, I don't know what your opinion is on it, but he can't find work on it anymore. And so he made a bet on a very deep, specific skill set that, and arguably his skill set in BI is very transferable. He's just got to take it into another kind of specific platform. So that's what I would say about that. I will also say that you will do very well if you really refine your kind of presentation into storytelling. And that doesn't, the problem with storytelling is that if you do it in a way that you're being disingenuous, politicians do this a lot, you people that are, seriously, in the US, you have people that are able to take data and present it in a way that is actually not inherently true, but they can present it in a way that it appears true. There's a great story where this guy named Jason Chavitz had presented data at a Senate hearing to the head of Planned Parenthood, and he took data that was actually real, but he presented it in a chart that was very well manipulated. And again, it's interesting because the data is true, the presentation was very, very manipulative. And that's an example of how people that are very good at their presentation skills and communication skills can take something and deceive someone else. So be good at presentation, but also be truthful. And that comes back to being constructive and knowing how to read data and to interpret it well. But I think it's always very good to be able to present data back as well. And there's two last things I'll say is there's some really good books on this as well. So this woman named, I think her name is Nancy Duarte, wrote a book called Resonate. She talks a lot about, it's not just the importance of the data itself, but how it's presented. It's a very, very good book, and I would recommend checking it out.
I kind of, agree with that. And so when I talk about building deep skills, it's about building in capability and not necessarily with a tool. Yeah. So let's say if I'm talking of building deep capability in data science, so it will be more focused around building more maths and statistical skills rather than some just programming languages skill, because that can be learned quickly and that can be adapted. But the code, and I'm actually very surprised how many aspiring data scientists actually focus more on the programming rather than learning the core mathematical capability. So I think that's one area which is kind of lacking, and there is a lot less attention to, which is very, very important. And secondly, I think that there are literature and companies who try to make this data scientist as a superhuman or a unicorn, having all kind of capabilities of presentation or engineering and everything bundled together. So to me, I don't think that person exists. So data science in that sense is a team and not one person.
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head. I think, just the fact that we all said, oh, a hackathon's a good approach, the ability to work with other people of other disciplines in a collaborative way and to build off each other's strengths, that's, I think, fundamentally key, because no one, with how fast things are changing, no one's going to know everything, right? I mean, there's something new every day. So being able to have that strong network, confidently leverage it in an effective way, and translate that into business value, I think, is the most fundamental need.
Hackathons are just like the perfect case study and metaphor for data done right, because the idea is you just throw all these people from different backgrounds that could be completely unrelated to data analytics, you throw them all together and you just create something, and oftentimes the results are amazing.
Yeah.
Many interesting points on this now. I think one thing I kind of think that comes out of this is also that it's the underlying sort of baseline is that it's a personal responsibility everyone has for themselves and for their own career. Like if I have someone on our team who comes up and says, hey, here's what I would like to learn, would that be in any way useful? Can I do it like through work? We're like, yeah, let's have a look whether that's overlapping with what we are building or what we want to do or not. Whereas the other opposite approach, and I guess you see that in the kind of especially in countries where the hierarchy of needs has really been kind of met all the way to the top, and people are a little bit more, come with a little bit more entitlement. They're like, here I am. What is your company going to make from me, right? And that's the mindset issue that's, I think, a little bit in contrast with the first example.
The only other thing that makes me think of is, fundamentally, I think we all would tell you that as businesses, Singapore is not the most cost-effective place to have a huge team of coders that are doing hardcore development, right? So, what we see happening more and more and more and more is that the core programming and everything is being offshored to places where that skill set exists in greater quantity and at a level that may be more difficult to find here. So if your desire is to remain in Singapore, which I presume it is, it's a great place to be, then you really do have to think about, okay, if I'm not doing that hardcore coding, I'm in it's a regional hub, where am I going to be able to deliver the most value? And I'll tell you, just being able to translate the data into business value and to translate a brief that comes from a business into something that a programming team can effectively do something with, that in and of itself is a unicorn and is incredibly valuable, especially here in Singapore.
I will definitely upvote that. I think that if you take nothing else away from tonight, that point about, you can learn all kinds of different skills, but if you can translate raw data into an insight that turns into a valuable business action, that's all you need to be doing.
I've got a last question for you guys, and I don't really know how to frame it exactly, so bear with me for a second here, right? So coming from Europe and spending nearly 10 years in Asia, one of my kind of the biggest takeaway on the differences how businesses run is that I feel, and it's my personal perception of it, is that in Europe or in sort of the Western part of the world, businesses are run a little bit more as a holacracy or meritocracy, where meaning here being a little bit more hierarchical, especially when we are kind of stripping away the MNC culture and leaving on the table the second tier enterprises that would be considered local companies in any country around here. And that innovation that I've been sort of seeing to be driven in these companies can often in Europe, in US, be driven out of the sort of the bottom line workforce, the people who actually are the doers. Whereas here it's more of a owner decides what's going to be done. Now, if you look at those big companies that are more of a local character anywhere in this region, you often looking people who are sitting on boards of those companies who don't even have an email because they are 70 years old on average. So how do we get, or how does general, suppose the society gets the point of importance of these topics through there?
So I laugh. I don't know if any of you saw in the news recently, because obviously my company, the owners are out of Japan. The head of, I think, cybersecurity for Japan, it was discovered, didn't have a computer, didn't know how to use one, and I think didn't know what a thumb drive or something like that was, right? So I think my perspective as an American, but it's been here for a long time, is relationships do matter a lot. And I don't think that is bad. I think it adds richness to the organization that perhaps in the West doesn't exist. But the reality is that fundamentally, you're going to have to translate those relationships into value. And when I try to hire somebody in Singapore that is a foreigner, the EP process is very much based on you have to come from these particular universities, right? So, when I found that, say, Raffles Girls' School in Singapore, you must have your daughter, in that school because that creates your future. And the whole kiasu nature of, stressing your kids out. I don't know what your perspective is with, but that is not something that's going to change within the next decade, I would say, fundamentally. So it does present a challenge somewhat. But I think they're trying, but there's a ways to go.
Yes. I've actually, was thinking about it. I've worked with a lot of family-driven organization businesses who have come to us, who have reached out saying that, we want to transform, we want to change. And one of the reasons for that is they are seeing the environment around them and they're feeling pressured about it. And second, there is a change of guard which is happening. So the next generation as it takes over. So I was working with this large conglomerate in Indonesia with 70-year-old patriarch looking at who's the chairman of the group. And so he has over 12 young people in the family, his brothers, cousins, and all of those. And so what he has done a couple of years back was he gave like one company each to these people to run. And they had
pretty normal, pretty average kind of scenario.
Yeah, and no, the interesting scenario was he almost made it like a game. They had, I remember McKinsey becoming like a coach and mentor and tracker of the performance of these people. And one of the key areas of our measurement was digitization, because the success of these people in the respective companies would decide who the next group chairman is going to be.
Wow.
That's a
Shark family, Shark Tank.
Yeah. So they gamified the whole thing. But the thing is that, all of these people, all of these 12 people who are running the company, they're like 30 to 40 years old, and they've all been educated in foreign universities, and then they're bringing their new perspectives. And all of them are trying to modernize the business. So I think that's where it is changing. The decision making, yes, that hierarchical structures, those cultural change will take some time, but I guess it's on the right track.
I think it's very deep-rooted in culture as well, something that we need to focus on, because like you correctly pointed out, some of this, which could be very hierarchical, it could be based on how many years this person have been in the company versus someone who could be really good, but he's only been with the firm for 2 years. And a lot of this is based on societal norms, and companies operate in those societal norms as well. So I think one of the things that I've seen is in startups, is reversed. It's more about who's the person who's able to get things done, and that person then quickly, is able to raise the ranks. It's in some of these more traditional companies and one of the bigger MNCs where I've seen someone who could have been in their role for 15, 20 years, and maybe they're not thinking of succession planning, and that happens. But I think surely, and it's more about timeline, right? People do know that in order to keep up with the time, they need to understand what are the things that's going on, not just in the market, but how do you keep up with times? And often that comes with a slow movement towards, okay, let's consider new blood. How can we hire differently? How can we promote and move people internally differently? So that change will happen, but it's going to take time.
Anything else, sir?
No, I think I agree with everything everybody said. So. Unless that was the last question, then I have to say something.
The only thing I would say is fundamentally it comes down to trust, right? So as you said before, data can be manipulated, right? So whether you trust somebody based on the relationship, whether you trust them based on the meritocracy and the work that they've done, it comes down to your ability to trust. And I think within Asia Pacific, that's all the more the case than perhaps even in the US.
Very cool. Thank you, guys. I think that's everything from me. Let's take some questions from the floor, if you have. And I think we've run a little bit over time, so we've got like 15 minutes, I think, maybe.
Okay, we have time maybe for 1 or 2 questions.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for sharing. I just want to know about this is across your organization. Is there anything like data encryptions that you currently practice among your organizations? Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
Data encryptions.
Data encryption?
Yes, that's right.
With what kind of data? Like just internal?
Internal data, or it can be like customer data or something like that.
Oh,
I think the companies are getting very serious about data encryption. They do realize, and in fact, there is a lot of fear, and right now it's one of the big, I would say, hindrance, or which is not letting companies realize the value from the data, because the fear that that data would get exposed and then they would face challenges. So, so I think that's one of the first topmost priorities when it comes to sharing the data or sharing, putting the data anywhere. It's top of the mind.
And I would say what I see increasingly happening, and everyone seems to know GDPR, is you need to really make an educated, strategic decision about what data you have in your organization, what data you let in your organization, because once it's in the organization, you're responsible for it. So what I see is that people are trying to reduce the need for encryption by reducing the data that comes into the organization, or doing it in a way so that the data can be activated against while remaining technically outside of the organization, right? So it's whether the data is, it's whether you're transforming that data, you're the owner of the data, there's legal definitions about what you're doing. And I think a lot of it is just trying to reduce the risk in the first place, so that isn't even as much of an issue.
Yeah, this is really important for us because Milieu, we collect a lot of declared opinion data and build profiles on the back of it. And so it's a question that comes up in every boardroom that we go to, but we have this principle of privacy by design. So that comes down to every panelist, but also the segments that we bucket them into. And so that translates into a lot of things I don't even understand in terms of how our tech people kind of abstract certain data points, so it can't be pulled back to PII. But on a more tactical level, we've also created a lot of rules in terms of all the people at Milieu that have access to our admin dashboard, that has access to our panelist backend data. There are different access rights that they have that allow them to go to different panels. So these are just two examples of a battery of different things that we have, both in technical encryption, but also access rights that have to be there. Otherwise, we'd be shut down.
Hi, I'm Avanish. I work for Merck, which is a life science firm. My question's on mostly for Shree. The schools which have started creating data science programs, they're quite new. The data science programs are quite new, maybe 3, 4, 5 years old. Do you see in the next 5, 10 years there's enough supply of talent for the industry, and or do we have to end up developing the skills internally to meet the demands?
A quick answer would be no, the supply is not enough. But to elaborate on that, right, and I guess that's why building talent within companies and how do you grow them is so crucial. While there is, there's two aspects to this. One is people are pretty sure that this is what they want to do, and students go and do this course in different universities, but that doesn't equip you. You have the fundamentals. Again, it's going back to the point that I made earlier. You have the fundamentals, but once you go into a role with the number of new technologies that keep coming out, like previously, no one, this is like, what, 10 years ago, machine learning, hardly people have heard about it, but now it is the case. Hadoop, I remember one of my hiring managers wrote a JD, and this was like 2, 3 years ago, and he said, we need someone with 10 years of experience. I went back to him and I went like, 10 years of experience doesn't exist for Hadoop, right? So it's really about how do you build that talent internally? While schools keep up to it and maybe come up with more sort of short courses, or it could even be majors that concentrate on data science, but how do companies build up their talent? So for example, a data science need for Go-Jek could be very different from a data science need that Visa might have. The skill sets in terms of technical could be the same, but the type of data you're looking into or the agility in which you need to switch your mindset to handle the data is going to be very different. So I would say the continued focus while traditional education systems build up their capacity is also for companies to look at, and this is to focus particularly on L&D, how they can sort of upskill their employees and give them the opportunities to work on different products, different projects, and scale them up.
Can I just add to that? Sure. I would just say on the point about data science being relatively new, I think the banner of maybe data science on schools is relatively new, but it's been around for a while. They just had different names, and it arguably goes back to even like library science and informatics to many years ago. I think that they've just gotten, like I went to a master's program called Information Studies, which is terribly outdated now, but the roots of this, it's kind of the intersection of kind of statistics and informatics that's kind of now created this what we call modern day data science. But it has been around for a while. What I think is good now is that there's a lot more programs offering it, both as full programs, but also as courses within programs, but also not just the traditional schools, but the kind of professional vocational schools like General Assembly offer these courses. And I would assume just by virtue of the supply of the learning courses that there's potentially going to be more, you know, in 3, 4, or 5 years, there's going to be more talent, but I could be wrong.
I think one of the things that we struggle with in the marketing industry is when anything is new, right? If you guys have heard of this concept called the hype cycle, right? So, you know, right now, data analytics, machine learning.
Trough of disillusionment.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. Artificial intelligence. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of hype, right? So, I mean, I personally think, you know, how can you say the core function of what you need to do to persuade somebody, to tell a narrative to somebody and define them to do so? It's been around since, you know, the beginning of, you know, selling soap or, you know, trying to convince the caveman next to you to marry your cousin or something. I mean, it's been there forever, and it's just new technologies that enable it. And I think one of the big challenges at the moment is with the Internet of Things, right, IoT, you know, your damn refrigerator, your car, your Fitbit, I mean, everything's giving off data. So, you know, I think what's changed is the fact that there's a lot of it, and it's being delivered in new ways, and that therein creates the challenge. But yeah, the fundamentals, I agree with both of you, are still there.
I think and this is what I feel, right? A lot of people tie technical skill sets to data science. They feel that you need to absolutely know Python or Hadoop in order to be doing anything that's data related, which is, it really depends on the role. And I feel that we need to move away from that mindset. And to the point that he made, these could be learned. You learn it, right? Just like how you learn a language. You learn these technical skill sets, and then you keep on evolving from that. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sumanto. I work for Nielsen. One of the challenges that I usually face when I talk to organizations is they directly relate data or acquisition of data to cost, whether it's an investment. You guys being a leader in your organization, how do you decide or how do you discuss that internally to put it aside, saying it's a cost rather than it's an investment of acquisition of data?
So how do you balance the investment in data versus the return?
Yeah, it's more of how do you go away from the discussion that data is important and it's not a cost of acquiring the data, but it's an investment in data.
Well, given what companies like Go-Jek or Grab or Singtel or whoever charge for it, right? Yeah, what you need to do is make a business case for the value that you're going to get out of it. And I think, again, talking about skill sets, the people that have the ability to make those business cases are incredibly valuable. Because, you know, if you go to your CEO of, you know, any multinational or a family company or whatever and say, look, this is the price tag for getting access to this data, there's going to be, at this stage of the industry, a bit of sticker shock. So what I tend to see that a lot of people are doing now, and I think Go-Jek and you know, your peer companies, Redmart, et cetera, you know, like, so we have Coca-Cola as a client, right? And so Coca-Cola partnering with Redmart, you know, now they finally have a sense of who's buying their product at the end of the day, because there's still a huge disconnect at the moment in traditional industries in FMCG. or tech, right? So your big tech companies that sell through distributors, anybody that sells through some sort of distribution product that doesn't actually touch the customer at the end of the day, there remains huge gaps there. And so you have to partner with the organizations that have that data. And there's a value exchange there that's essential, and I think most of us on a day-to-day basis have conversations related to that, because it's an ongoing debate, which is why you bring it up. It's not easy.
I think just to add on, so I had a situation where we were trying to get, there was tons of questions on where is the talent base for this particular role? Should we base our data center there? Where do we move it? And at that point, LinkedIn just introduced their Talent Insight portfolio, where you could actually extract some of this data, like how many people with this skill set are in this particular country, where could it be, and HR had to do it, right? And when we were looking at it, I had to actually put up a case and to go like, okay, why are we purchasing this? What's the cost? What's the ROI? Well, it didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of discussions, and I eventually had to talk about it from the aspect of this is not just a HR beneficial decision. It's also for business. If you want to set up a particular team or a particular data center somewhere, you need to make sure that you have the talent there. Who are we losing our talent to? And all this information, to the point that he made, we were able to extract that value from the investment that we made. So it's really quite painstaking at the initial stages, but I think once you're able to translate that into what you will gain from it, the value that you will get out of it, people tend to go like, okay, let's just give this a shot and see what we can do.
True. The only thing I would say is that it is hard, especially if you're talking about like really a big investment or spend in moving like to a new data infrastructure, a new platform, or even just triggering someone to say, okay, we've got to get out of Excel and get into something that's a big investment. It's tough. It's tough to convey the opportunity cost of data, because if you do it and you succeed, you don't have a benchmark to say, well, this is what it would look like if we didn't do it. The only thing I have to offer is two things. One, Avinash Kaushik, who's a really important kind of thought leader in the realm of analytics, has some interesting writings on return on analytics, ROA. I just read it. It's somewhat abstract, but he gives some really interesting insights on how you could potentially put some measurability to it. The other thing, when I was at Sapien, I talked a lot about data strategy, and we only ended up doing it for one client, but we put up, created a metric called time to action. So the problem was, client had this really great team of data scientists that were just feeding the dev team for an app all these great insights, and they would give them insights, and then it would take about 7 weeks for them to change a button from purple to green. And it was like, okay, so the problem isn't actually you have the talent, but you don't have the functional or organizational means to implement it. And so we set up this metric, which was essentially time to action from the point that we deliver the insight to the team to them committing the code deployment and getting it live. Their metric just basically became shortening that time frame. And so that's one example of ways you can kind of make it more measurable.
Yeah, I think across the companies that I've worked with, everyone would expect a business case, before taking any kind of data-led initiative. And, apart from that, support it with a short pilot program, typically, where they would see certain benefits coming out. It may not be the full scale. And then, basis the success of that scale it up. So that's been the process, across whatever clients that I've worked at. So you go with a business case, do a proof of concept, a pilot, and then scale up.
Sorry. Okay, this was our last question. So I guess Pavel, we run like 20 minutes out of time. So we have some drinks in the back for you, some wine, soft drinks. But before that, please let me thank you, our amazing panelists, moderator, and SGInnovate for having us, and all of you, of course, to joining us and asking great questions. So our panelists, I hope, will stay for a few more minutes to answer your questions out of the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you.